So I'm calling this initial explorations towards a conference decision. Next slide. So the mandate that was given at the last virtual plenary was basically to explore and to make some recommendations. What I found is that there's an evolution taking place even now in the church's life and thought, that the reality shaping the church's self-understanding today is moving the church in a certain direction, but that very direction is dividing the church. And that is something which I'm not going to fool myself. I think we have to face squarely to what extent there may be divisions among us on what we see synodality doing to the church. But the International Theological Commission on the 2nd of March 2018 put forward this really what I consider wonderful document. First of all, it raises these three themes: communion, synodality, and collegiality. If you remember, John Paul II, at the end of the second millennium, the beginning of the third,
yes,
introduced communio as a core element. It had been there before the divisions within the church as to what should be the core theological concept after Vatican II. But John Paul put his stamp on communion as the core element, and I think it's a fantastic thing that we've been carrying to. Just not so in that document, there's this definition: synodality is a specific modus vivendi et operandi of the church, the people of God, which reveals and gives substance to her being as communion, when all her members journey together in assembly and take an active part in her evangelizing mission. Right. So it's not just a new word, it's at the heart of what it means to be church. And it's an evolving reality in need of clear theological principles and decisive pastoral orientations. So that whereas the word synod itself had a certain meaning referring only to the bishop's synod, really it is now looking for theological principles and pastoral orientations. And one of the things which the document puts forward is this: all the members of the church are synodos. We are companions on the journey by virtue of the dignity of baptism and our friendship with Christ, quoting Ignatius of Antioch. By virtue of baptism and a friendship with Christ. And where it suggests is that it moves us towards an inverted pyramid, where those who are to be served are at the top, and they are the ones who are really together on the journey. Whereas previously we thought of the bishops at the top and doing the synodal work. And it calls for participation and co-responsibility with a distinction of tasks in the reciprocity that communion requires. Right? Communion is not a one-way street, it's a reciprocal reality. So, and this is important, synodality is a style of leadership in which hierarchical and charismatic gifts are co-essential. A style of leadership. Next slide. In the local church, therefore, what is being called for is a synodal style in the daily life of the church as the basis for effective missionary conversion. And that's a tall order. The daily life of the church. In other words, everybody is being called to a sense of synodos, walking on the road together. And that the way we make decisions in everything is governed by that synodal style. And what it calls for is effective missionary conversion. And that is, it was mentioned in the earlier session this morning, that really we have to become a more missionary church. And we become that through acting in synod. And what the Theological Commission lists some structures that serve synodal life if they can all come into a synodal style. The College of Consultants, previously seen quite simply as a set of guys who are helping the bishop, right? And who only come into play when a bishop dies. But in truth and in fact, if they have a synodal style, it's a different ball game. The Council of Priests, not simply again as being at the service of the bishop in the governance of the diocese, but creating a whole way, and we'll look at what that will involve later on, And they also listed diocesan pastoral council. What I found interesting was that they listed assemblies. Those of you who know the recent history of the church in the Caribbean, I mean, that sense of assembly began in 1977 in Trinidad. We used the word, we didn't use the word synod, because at the time Archbishop Pantin felt that that word was laden with canonical constraints. We used the word assembly and it took off. And now I'm seeing that it's being used generally in situations where you don't want to go down the synod road with its canonical obligations, but you do want to have this fellowship of the church. And then the document lists parish pastoral councils and suggests that they should be made obligatory. Now that is a question for us as well, because I find in my diocese a number of priests are saying it's not obligatory, and they pull out the canons as they interpret them. My understanding is that a bishop can make them obligatory, but what the document is saying, they should be obligatory in a synodal church. And I have added clergy retreat. I just came out of my own clergy retreat, and it was a wonderful experience. It's the fourth retreat that I've had, and as I said to the brothers, I felt in terms of the spirit of the retreat and the sense of collaboration and cooperation between the local clergy, the 4 native priests that we have, and the others, all of that was really fantastic. And then the document refers to Episcopal conferences, and it's interesting to note that the principal objective listed is simply cooperation between bishops for the common good of the churches entrusted to them. And when Ken was speaking just now, my mind went back to this. It's for the common good. And how do we determine the common good of the Antillean church? That's a question for us. There's a category which is listed there called ecclesial conventions, which take place in Italy every 10 years. I think the Germans have them more regularly. But it's somewhere in between assemblies and synods. The main call of the document is a conversion to renew and recover for the Roman Church synodality as a style. And in paragraph 105, it speaks about renewing mentalities, attitudes, practices, and structures in order to be ever more faithful to her vocation. Can we, as bishops in the Antilles, see ourselves that? What mentalities do we need to renew among ourselves? Attitudes, practices, structures. Again, as Ken was speaking just now, the tension between our care for our individual dioceses and our care for the region is real. So there is a call for personal conversion in the spirituality of communion and the call to live it. A conversion of mind and heart, and this is very important, disciplined training for welcoming and listening to one another. What the document suggests is this does not happen automatically. There has to be a disciplined training for welcoming and listening to one another at every level of church life. Every level of church life. Can we do that? Zoom, for me as a personal experience, has been part of that learning where you have to listen to people. Sometimes you don't see their face, but it's a discipline, that much I'm sure. And then sentire cum ecclesia. Why I put that in here is because the translation of it, which is given in the document, usually when people say sentire cum ecclesia, they talk about feeling with the church. But the document adds to feel, to sense, and to perceive in harmony. To feel, to sense, and perceive in harmony with the church. So it's more than just a sentire in the literal translation of that. And then it uses the Eucharistic synaxis model, of listening to the word and then coming to communion with each other and so on, reminding us that the Eucharist is more than just a structure that we say Mass every day. It is a whole way, and we ought to learn that from it. So then it suggests a process of listening and dialogue for communal discernment. And Pope Francis has said this often enough, the priority of discernment over decision-making. I think that is something that we have to get under our skins. Now, Gabriel, Francis, and Emmanuel, in coming back from the synod with Francis Alain, They have reminded us that we should take some moments during our own meetings to step back from the rush to decision making. But discernment is something that you have to learn as well. How do we practice that? The communal discernment, in that sense, I think the religious, especially the sisters, can teach us diocesan clergy and people around dioceses what that involves, because it is a learning process. And it is at the heart of all synodal processes and events, where the document suggests you're contemplating both the word and the people, And that is something which my own clergy said to me, that you think you know your people. Of course, me not being born in Grenada, one or two of the Grenadians can always throw that at me. You think you know your people. But I think even when we're born in the place, like I can't claim to know Trinidadians as people are going through all that they're going through now. So the main push is for synodal dialogue. And I quote in full from, it depends on courage, both in speaking and in listening. It is not about engaging in a debate where one speaker tries to get the better of the others or counters their positions with brusque arguments, but about expressing whatever seems to have been suggested by the Holy Spirit as useful for communal discernment. At the same time, being open to accepting whatever has been suggested by the same Spirit in other people's positions. And it strikes that, do we, when we are out to speak, is it simply that I want to say this, or is it that I'm encouraging in myself a sensitivity to the Spirit of God so that I make a contribution to communal discernment? That calls a radical conversion in the ways we think. The last sections, one has to do with synodality and the ecumenical journey. It sees that ecumenism is important to that. And then the last section there, the synodality and social diaconia, the practice of dialogue and the search for effective joint solutions by which we commit ourselves to peace and justice are an absolute priority in a situation where there is a structural crisis in the procedures of democratic participation and a loss of confidence in its principles and inspirational values with the threat of authoritarian and technocratic aberrations. When I read that, my heart leapt for joy in terms of something which I've been feeling with regard to the Caribbean. We have, if we build a synodality into the very life of the church, we make a contribution to the structural crisis in the procedures of democratic participation. Because those who come out of this as men and women who have been taking part in pastoral councils and parish councils and so on, will have a pattern of action in these things, where they are listening to the Spirit and therefore bringing a uniquely Christian contribution to what is happening in our territories. The very last section here, the parousia of the Spirit. Where's the Spirit in all of this? The trust, frankness, and courage to enter into the expanse of God's horizon. Wow. In order to ensure that a sacrament of unity exists in the world, in the Antilles, and that men and women are therefore not destined for dispersion and confusion. Wow. Right now, there are a number of questions that people are asking in the region. Are we simply educating our youth to send them overseas? Dispersion. Will we be always caught up in all the confusions of small island states, which we referred to before? Or can we think in terms of the church, the AEC, in the very way we function, as a sacrament of unity for the Antillean world? So against that background, a synod for the Antilles, question mark, and I put that question mark still at this point because I'm not saying we have to have it. I think we have to ask ourselves, again, in the Spirit, what is God asking of us now? It's process and event. Yeah. We've had precedents. We've had synods and assemblies. We've seen what it means to have preparation, celebration, implementation. And what we need to do is the evaluation of our experiences, not simply us as bishops talking about it, but really, what do our people think? I think most dioceses have had some kind of synod experience. The more recent ones, the ones that for me seem to have a lot to share with us. One is Cayenne, and Emmanuel shared a lot of his stuff with us, and that can be looked at again. And then more recently, Robert in Castries, doing something as part of a transition. And I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but that was the impression I have from him, that he saw the synod which they've just completed as preparing the way for the transition from one archbishop to another. What have been the ways forward for us, especially since Robert's synod had to take place virtually. Move on, next slide, please. So the AEC challenges a question of time, space, and language. The C divides us. How much time do we have to take what kind of process? And then the language question. The time will have to be answered, I think, when we've gone through an evaluation of where we want to go with this. The space question is, I want to suggest, a multiple thing. It can take place in provinces, it can take place within dioceses, it can certainly take place virtually. There's all kinds of different spaces we can occupy. The language one is a difficult one for me, and I think it's a challenge to us. We have not, in my view, until today we tried a bit, paid as much respect as we ought to the Francophones among us. And even Carol, as a Dutch speaking, if Carol had not studied at the seminary in Trinidad, would he be as fluent in English as he is? You know? And then when we're talking about something for the Caribbean church, how do we deal with the language question? That's for real. So the way forward, what I'm suggesting is we may be able to accomplish a truly and fully Caribbean Antillean experience for sharing, listening, transforming, and being transformed. Dialogue, listening, transformation. That would be the basic. And there are some things which I see as being part of that. First of all, our church and history. That we face some of the historical issues and we ask people to really help us to look at them. On these first 3 points, it's really where we have to reach out to people and ask them to help us. The social analysis of our Caribbean reality, social, political, economic, psychological, and spiritual. The spiritual not being a separate thing, because I think part of our Catholic genius is that we are not dichotomous in the way we look at things. It's not spiritual and material, spiritual and physical. It's the integration that is our Catholic genius, even in our interpretation of Scripture. And then, if we do these things, then we need a broad regional engagement in understanding and claiming these analyses. How do we get all our Catholics involved, as many as possible, in really taking hold of what we're seeing and making it their own? Here, I think it's going to be very important to look not only, because we have a habit, I feel, when we claim things like this for church, of including the people who are regular in church. Henry Charles always used to say that there's a church out there that we're not listening to. And what he meant was that there are people out there who are still proud to be Catholic. Whenever anything happens in the church that they can identify with, oh boy, they're proud to say they're Catholic. When bishops speak out in difficult situations, yes, that's my church, and they're not talking the crap that some other churches are talking. That is there, and that is part of church. So communications, excuse the typo, communications become fundamental in this regional engagement. I took the liberty of asking 1 or 2 people to write some things, and that should help us as we go forward. And then fourth, look at identification of priorities for pastoral action in the region. We, as we've said before, we really are being very individualistic. And here, Ken talked about individualism, but I think it's very important in language-wise to recognize that there's a difference between individualism. Sorry, it wasn't Ken, it was Robert. There's a big difference between individualism and individuality. All the isms the church sees as extreme. But when you talk about individuality, that's an important thing to treasure, Robert was reminding us. So how do we identify those priorities, for action? There are one or two which I think we can identify as common, and there's some that I find we're acting too much in our silos, which is one of the big categories that we had earlier on, and which I don't think we must lose. We have to realize that that is what is. And in education and catechetics, that those two affect me as a bishop in a very particular way. That I think education is going down the drain, Catholic education, because we're not able to pull together in resourcing. So as we do all of those first four things, what we should come to is a point of sharing and experiencing together successful projects. So the vision is something which I'm trying to apply now in Grenada, where I've called it a congress because I didn't want to use the word synod, and assembly has a bad taste from previous experiences. But what we've come to, we've had some of the general discussion, and now we're at a stage where people have gone back to their parishes, not to say what I have said or what we have said, but to do things, to do projects. And it is turning out to be amazing what people are coming up with. I mean, simple things at parish level, but things which we hope in January to be able to bring those together and share the successful projects. I just put that forward. And then as a regional church, to be able to discern what are the areas and possibilities for collaboration. That we should really be able to collaborate on some things and work together rather than multiplying. Catechetics is one thing. I think communications, for example, one of the successes of the past year in Grenada is what has happened communications-wise. We have a communications chair who is really a wonderful woman. She's been very much a part of the sickness movement. And we've taken risks. But now what we're talking about among ourselves is that, hey, we should be able to share programs and so on with other islands. I've seen some things on Facebook that come from Barbados, from Jamaica, which could be shared. So discerning collaborative possibilities. Next. What is driving a lot of this, even from the beginning? I think Joe Harris was very strong on this, that we have a Caribbean that seems to be disintegrating. And what we would really like to be able to do is, as a church, to bear witness to fellowship and unity, so that the Catholic Church becomes one church, one people, as a clear sign to the rest of the region of what the will of God for the Caribbean is. And if we do that, I think that in itself will be a witness of evangelization with all that that will involve. The big question remains practicality for this. Zoom allows us to do a lot of things, but what I'm thinking of, and what one person put to me as a way forward, and that is that we don't aim simply at getting what is done so we have one big thing. That each province, maybe even each diocese, yeah, that's it, thanks, could move, as we move together through Zoom and so on, that there is a need to have one or two events in the province or in the diocese, right? Interim events with some external participation. So you leave room if the Archdiocese of Kingston is having something, that people from Port of Spain, people from Castries can come and be a part of it. So we're not aiming simply to have this big thing, but that's one way to carry it forward. And then finally, the other way to carry it forward, if the state of the world allows, is to have a grand event taking the patois Zafé Catholique. That means a Catholic thing, a big Catholic thing, Zafé Catholique. Again, how that will come across, God alone knows. But that's the end of what I want to present. It's originally when I said yes, I really hadn't thought of it as something that would be going the way it has gone. I really thought that I would pull together a little committee and just present something in January so that the permanent board could look at it and make a decision for the next plenary session in May. But the way things have turned out, this is how it's gone. We still, the bishops would have to say we want to carry this further. It would mean appointing a committee, well, committee a bad word, but a group to make some of the concrete decisions about what way we want to go. Okay, thank you for listening.